Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, March 24th, 2023. Will the additional $80 billion in IRS funding lower the tax gap? In the Senate Finance Committee hearing in October of 2021, then IRS Commissioner Reddick admitted that the U.S. is losing $1 trillion a year to evasion. Since the total tax receipts for 2021 were $4.05 trillion, this means that $5 trillion should have been collected, and that calculates out to an evasion rate of 20%. Now, instead of condemning these evaders for the lawbreakers they are, more and more people are wondering how they can evade taxes themselves. More and more employees are looking for side hustles that will allow them to not only supplement their income, but also pay less or even no taxes on the additional income they receive. Now, the ruling elite and their minions in Congress know that this is a real problem, and this is the real reason that the U.S. Treasury and the IRS are proposing to tax the sales of used goods by individuals with new 1099-K rules. Now, those rules were supposed to have gone into effect last year, but they've been delayed until this year. The growing evasion has also prompted the ruling elite to propose new rules that would give the IRS unprecedented access to individuals' bank and credit card transactions. Fortunately, the people saw that proposal for what it was, a gross invasion of privacy, and the elite and their minions had to back down. Well, now they're trying a different approach. The 2022 Inflation Reduction Act contains a provision that increases the budget for the Internal Revenue Service by $80 billion over 10 years. Now, the Biden administration has promised that this massive expansion of the IRS will not target middle-class taxpayers. Instead, it will enhance tax enforcement efforts and eliminate most of the $1 trillion in evasion. Now, that sounds good. Who could possibly object to catching tax cheats? Well, the problem is that people who are evading taxes don't identify themselves as cheaters on their tax returns. Quite the contrary. They do everything they can to hide their illegal efforts and make their returns appear legitimate. Consequently, enhancing tax enforcement means that these 87,000 new IRS agents are going to have to look at all tax returns with suspicion. In order to catch the minority who are actually evading their taxes, the IRS is going to have to subject everyone to more intense scrutiny, much of it undeserved. Now, of course, the big question is whether or not the pain imposed on all Americans by this enhanced enforcement will actually accomplish the stated goal of closing the tax gap by significantly reducing evasion. There's pretty good reason to believe that it won't. The Peter G Peterson Foundation released a study entitled, "Would Increased Funding for the IRS Narrow the Tax Gap?" Now, here are some of their findings. The increased IRS funding would yield $186 billion in additional revenues over 10 years, but $186 billion minus the $80 billion in additional funding to the IRS comes to a net recovery to the U.S. Treasury of $80.66 billion over 10 years. And the IRS is expected to face difficulty hiring experienced revenue agents, and this may further reduce the additional taxes collected. So in conclusion, the ruling elite and their minions are desperate to keep the income payroll tax system in place. It gives them control over us, and it can be used as a giant ATM machine. Politicians make a lot of money selling federal income tax favors to special interests. The Peterson Foundation study shows how ineffectual the new enhanced enforcement will be at reducing the amount of evasion. Now, assume the study is correct in stating that the enhanced enforcement will bring in an additional $80.6 billion over 10 years. Let's also assume an unlikely best-case scenario in which the evasion rate remains steady. Now, at $1 trillion a year, that's $10 trillion in evasion over 10 years. So, collecting an additional $80.6 billion over 10 years will reduce evasion from $10 trillion to $9,919,400 million. Now, is this worth the pain and suffering that all of us will have to endure as the IRS goes after all of us? One of the factors that led to the French Revolution was the fact that taxes were only paid by the common people. The fact that nobles and the wealthy were not taxed in the 1830s Germany was one of the prime factors Marx pointed to in writing Das Kapital. Albert Einstein said, "We can't solve our problems with the same kind of thinking we used to create them." Using Einstein's logic, there's a fantastic way to lower evasion. Repeal the income payroll tax system and enact the fair tax. The fair tax transfers power from the government to the people. We'll control how much tax we pay by our spending habits. The fair tax eliminates payments by special interests to Congress for exemptions from the tax. The fair tax will greatly reduce evasion, provide the prebate which actually increases spendable income for lower income people, and makes American-made goods much more competitive on the world market. This will increase global demand for American products and result in more and better American jobs. Now, there's going to be a vote on the fair tax in the House of Representatives. Speaker McCarthy and the other elites didn't want it, but it was forced on him. So, we now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to show where they stand. They can vote for the present income payroll tax system, or they can vote for the fair tax. They can support the corrupt income tax in the IRS or eliminate it. It can't be any simpler than that. They can hide the true cost of government, or they can pass the fair tax and show everyone the true cost of government on every retail receipt. They can support the largest transfer of power from the government to the people, the fair tax, or not. Now, if members think the fair tax needs to be changed in some way, then they can propose the changes. Don't condemn the entire bill because it has a flaw that can be easily addressed. So please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the fair tax. The fair tax doesn't pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the fair tax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The fair tax collects the revenue the federal government needs to operate, but does so in a way that has the least impact on our individual freedom and the least impact on our economic prosperity. With a fair tax, there are no tax returns to file, no records to keep. We pay our federal taxes when we make retail purchases of new goods and services. With a fair tax, there's no need for the IRS either. If you sell a used couch or a used jet ski online, there is no fair tax due on that transaction. The fair tax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken. It's no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with a fair tax. So join us and take back control of our country and our lives. Not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. We should all remember Edmund Burke's warning that applies to our efforts to take back control. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. We should also remember this quote from George Orwell's 1984, which, if we do nothing, may foretell your and your children's future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives and attend Zoom town hall meetings demanding that if they really want to allow Americans to take back control, the first step is to eliminate the income payroll tax system and enact the fair tax. Take back control. Help us pass the fair tax. Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing, or maybe we should say investing, $10.40 a month, you can help provide the financial base to Americans for fair taxation. If you can make larger contributions or investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to fairtax.org and invest in AFFT. It's your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org.